Welcome to today's deep dive. We've got a really fascinating mission for you today.
We really do.
We're tackling the profoundly moving lectures of Professor Erasmus Cromwell-Smith.
Right. The fictional, but honestly incredibly wise academic.
Exactly. And specifically, we're zooming in on Book 1, Chapter 13 of his teachings.
Which is such a dense, beautiful chapter.
It is. The goal here is to really explore his vision of love.
Yeah.
But, not just as some fleeting abstract emotion.
Right. Not the fairy tale version.
Yeah, but as an actual, what he calls a structural masterpiece.
I love that phrasing.
Me too.
Yeah.
A mechanism that requires precise engineering and balance to keep from completely collapsing.
It's a remarkable piece of literature, really, because we usually operate under this assumption that someone who has reached the absolute pinnacle of their academic field,
Oh, sure.
someone who has mastered philosophy, survived intense personal adversity, and can synthesize all this complex logic, we assume they just possess some secret manual for life.
Right, a manual that the rest of us just never received. We expect them to be, practically invincible.
Exactly.
But I want to set the scene for you right now because the opening of this chapter just completely shatters that illusion.
It really does. It's such a stark contrast.
So picture this. It's a crisp autumn morning on a university campus, and the highly educated, profoundly respected Professor Cromwell-Smith is riding his old rusty bicycle through the campus back roads.
Just kind of cruising along.
But the thing is, he isn't commuting. He's been pedaling aimlessly, literally in circles, for over an hour.
The visual of this, titan of the lecture hall just drifting on a rusty bike is incredibly striking.
It's almost funny, right?
It is. It immediately disarms you. It kind of humanizes him before he even speaks.
Yeah, and he's pedaling aimlessly because he has just been struck by this devastating realization.
A really heavy one.
Yeah. He's reflecting on his incredible mentors over the years. They taught him almost everything about navigating the world,
Right. They taught him philosophy, survival.
Exactly. They taught him how to survive the darkest, most tragic times in his life. But he realizes, with a really heavy heart, that they never actually taught him how to find love.
Which highlights the ultimate blind spot of pure intellect, I think.
Oh, definitely.
You can, memorize every philosophical text ever written, but that data offers zero protection against the actual complexities of human connection.
It's like having a map of the ocean but not knowing how to swim.
That's a great way to put it. And what really stands out to me is how the source material manages the transition from that realization out on the bike path into the classroom.
The tonal shift is wild.
It is. When the professor finally parks that bike and steps into the auditorium, the atmosphere changes instantly. We move away from that slightly witty image of the absent-minded professor,
Right.
and we just plunge into this exceptionally empathetic, almost hushed gravitas.
You can practically hear the room quiet down just reading it.
Totally.
The text actually describes his students as being in a state of transfixed silence.
They know something serious is coming.
Right. And before he even begins the actual lesson, the professor employs this very specific habit of his.
I find this so fascinating.
Yeah, he opens his readings with a Latin-inspired word. He uses it almost like a spell to set the intention for the room.
Like casting a net over the audience.
Exactly. And today's word is obsequium.
Obsequium, which translates roughly to compliance and devotion.
Which, I found myself wondering why a lesson on love requires a demand for compliance.
Right, it seems kind of strict.
Yeah. It almost sounds contradictory to what love is supposed to be.
It does sound contradictory on the surface, but think about how modern society usually talks about love.
Usually pretty cynically.
Exactly. We are incredibly cynical, or we treat it like this cheap, disposable commodity in pop culture.
Oh, for sure. Just swipe right.
Right. So by opening with a demand for devotion and compliance, the professor is stripping away that modern cynicism.
He's demanding respect for the topic.
Exactly. It serves as this vital psychological function. It's an auditory cue that essentially says, drop your armor.
Oh, wow. I like that.
It prepares the mind and forcibly opens the heart to the immense, raw vulnerability of the lesson ahead. Because, you cannot truly examine the structure of love while maintaining a defensive posture.
That makes so much sense. It really is a priceless gift to the students in the room and honestly to you, the listener, as we dive into this.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's unpack the actual lesson. Because once that armor is dropped, the professor introduces the first of 3 poems written by his own mentor.
Right, the woman referred to simply as Mrs. V.
Yeah, and the first poem asks the foundational question, what is love?
The big one.
The big one. And the imagery the author uses to answer this is just stunning. It starts by describing the bewildering feat of two souls being completely smitten.
The phrase bewildering feat is so incredibly deliberate.
How so?
Well, it frames love not as some inevitability that just happens to everyone, but as an impossible magic trick.
Oh, right.
A trick that somehow, inexplicably, actually works against all the odds.
I love that, and the auditory details push that idea even further.
Yeah, the whispering.
Yeah, the poem talks about the whisperings and whistlings of infatuated hearts existing in a world entirely their own.
It's so evocative.
It really paints a picture of the peace and ease of two spirits who are completely, effortlessly comfortable in their own private universe.
It perfectly captures the glorious isolation of early romance.
That bubble phase.
Exactly. That phenomenon where the rest of the world, with all its chaotic noise and demands, just completely fades into the background.
Yeah.
The only thing that actually registers is the profound peace you found in this new shared bubble.
Okay, but I want to challenge this a bit.
Go for it.
I want to bring in a concept from an earlier chapter in the source material. The professor previously compared this early stage to falling willingly into a rabbit hole of infatuation.
Right, the tumbling down.
Yeah, you tumble down into this magical, dizzying space. But looking at this through a really practical lens, that rabbit hole phase, that constant euphoria where everything is just whisperings and peace, it doesn't last.
No, it never does.
Right? Real life always intrudes. You eventually have to, argue about finances or deal with family stress or just manage the daily grind of doing the dishes.
Mundane stuff.
Exactly. So how can this temporary peace and ease possibly serve as the foundation for an enduring relationship in the real world?
That is the million-dollar question. And you've identified the exact trap that the text is warning us about.
Oh, really?
Yes. The euphoric isolation of the rabbit hole isn't the foundation at all.
It's not.
No, it's just the bait.
Wow. Okay.
The text provides this brilliant mechanism for how we actually survive the end of that honeymoon phase.
Oh, did what?
It defines the operational mechanism of love as the ultimate empathy.
Ultimate empathy. Okay, that moves it from a feeling into like an action.
Precisely. Empathy in this context isn't just offering a sympathetic nod when your partner has a bad day at work.
Right. Oh, that sucks.
Exactly. It's not that. It is the grueling, perpetual exercise of placing oneself completely in the other person's shoes.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Because when the euphoria fades and the mundane stresses of life hit, it is incredibly easy to retreat into your own ego.
To just worry about your own stress.
Right. The ultimate empathy is the cognitive bridge that prevents that retreat. It forces you to view the relationship's challenges from their perspective, even when you are exhausted or angry.
Okay, I see. So the euphoria, the rabbit hole, gets you into the relationship.
Yes.
But the active muscular practice of empathy is what actually allows a couple to transition into the next phase.
Without that empathy acting as a bridge, the rabbit hole just becomes a dead end.
You just hit the bottom and stay there.
Exactly. And making that transition requires a really fundamental shift in identity, which actually brings the professor to the second poem he shares with his hushed class.
Right. What is true love?
Yes. This is where the deep dive moves from the lighter infatuation into a much heavier, much more profound concept.
It gets intense here.
Very. The source defines true love as the moment when your heart no longer belongs to you.
It really describes a state of total surrender.
It does.
The text says true love is unconditional. It paints this visceral picture where your skin physically aches without the other's touch.
Yeah, that imagery is so powerful.
And it describes a state where two distinct, independent souls surrender their individual boundaries and literally fuse into one.
And to understand the mechanics of this surrender, we really have to look at the broader philosophical framework Professor Cromwell-Smith teaches.
The tightrope.
Yes. Throughout his lectures, he compares human life to walking a tightrope.
Right.
Every single day, we are equilibrists, right? We're trying to balance our careers, our personal joys, our tragedies, and just our mundane routines on this incredibly thin, precarious wire.
And a slight breeze can completely throw you off.
Exactly.
Medical diagnosis, a lost job, a family crisis. Suddenly you're wobbling.
Right. So in that tightrope metaphor, true love acts as the harmonic pole of the equilibrist.
Okay, unpack the harmonic pole for us.
Sure, think about an actual tightrope walker. They carry that massive long pole horizontally.
Yeah, the really bendy one.
Right. That pole lowers their center of gravity and creates resistance against the wind. Love operates as that pole.
Oh, I see.
It steadies the walker. Now, it doesn't magically make the tightrope wider.
Life is still hard.
Exactly. And it certainly doesn't stop the wind from blowing. But it gives purpose, meaning, and crucial physical stability to the dangerous balancing act of life.
Having a harmonic pole sounds incredibly empowering.
It is.
It frames love as like the ultimate safety measure for navigating existence.
Absolutely.
But I want to bring in a vital counterpoint from the source material here.
Yes, the student's question.
Right. In the auditorium, a student named Jimmy actually raises his hand and asks a highly critical question.
Such a great moment.
He essentially asks, if true love is this unconditional, empowering harmonic pole, why does the author constantly warn us that it requires so much grueling hard work and delicate handling?
It's a very logical question.
Yeah. If it's a structural safety device, shouldn't it just work automatically? You hold it, you're safe.
Right, but the synthesis the text provides here is so profound because it relies on the physical reality of a harmonic pole.
Which is?
A balancing pole might stabilize you, but it is incredibly heavy.
Right.
You might be handed the pole naturally through that initial spark of connection we talked about.
A rabbit hole.
Yes, but holding on to it, gripping it tightly, and constantly adjusting its weight while the winds of life howl at you.
That's the work.
That requires immense daily intention.
It's the paradox of the burden and blessing.
Exactly. It stabilizes you only if you possess the strength and the discipline to hold it correctly.
And if you don't?
If you get lazy or if you mismanage the pole, the sheer dead weight of it will actually be the very thing that pulls you down.
It'll send you plummeting from the wire.
It is both your salvation and your heaviest responsibility.
Which introduces the absolute core engineering problem of Chapter 13.
How do we do it?
Exactly. How do we actually manage that heavy work?
Yeah.
How do we build a structure capable of supporting the weight of the harmonic pole without just snapping in half?
Right.
To answer that, the professor reads the third poem, introducing the central metaphor of the chapter, the Three-Legged Stool.
We move away from the poetry of the soul straight into relational architecture.
I love this shift here.
Me too. The premise is stark. A great couple, a relationship capable of actually enduring the tightrope, requires 3 distinct, non-negotiable legs to stay upright.
Non-negotiable. So let's break down the mechanics of these 3 legs, because the text defines them with surprising nuance.
Very surprising.
Leg number 1 is friendship. Now, we usually define friendship as, loyalty, honesty, shared interest.
Having fun together.
Right. But the source includes a specific requirement that I found fascinating. It says true friendship in a relationship relies on a healthy level of tension.
Yes, that detail completely redefines how we view compatibility.
How so?
Well, many people mistakenly believe that the perfect relationship is one entirely devoid of conflict.
Where you never argue.
Right, a dynamic where you just agree on absolutely everything and act like incredibly polite roommates.
But the text argues that a lack of tension is actually a structural weakness.
Exactly.
A healthy tension is the ability to hold a mirror up to your partner. It's the friction required to say, hey, you are off course, or you aren't living up to your own values right now.
That takes real guts.
It does. And if you don't have the kind of friendship that can survive that tension, you don't actually have a solid leg.
No, you just have an echo chamber.
Right. Which brings us to the second leg, passion.
The spark.
Yeah. The source describes this as the unbridled spark. It's the space where, quote, flesh ignites without control, and the private fantasies of the mind are allowed to transform into physical reality.
And I think it's crucial to distinguish this from the earlier rabbit hole phase.
Okay, yeah. What's the difference?
Passion here isn't just that initial honeymoon infatuation that happens automatically.
Right.
It is the raw electric desire that keeps the connection vital years down the line.
It's a sustained energy.
Exactly. It's the primal energy that prevents the relationship from devolving into a purely logistical partnership.
Yeah, managing a mortgage together.
Right, avoiding the roommate syndrome. And that leads directly to the third leg, which is love.
Now, notice how the author separates love from passion.
Yeah, that's key.
They're not the same structural element at all.
Not at all.
The text describes love not as some unbridled fire, but as a delicate rose garden that demands constant, tender care.
I absolutely love that distinction. Passion is the fire, but love is the daily, often super unglamorous tending of the soil.
Pulling the weeds?
Exactly. It's the conscious choice to nurture the emotional well-being of the other person, making sure the actual colors of life continue to shine.
So we have friendship with healthy tension, unbridled passion, and the tender care of love.
The three-legged stool.
Let's apply some architectural logic to this. If you are building a physical structure, like a house or even a real stool, it cannot balance on 2 legs.
Right, it defies physics.
It defies physics. So if you apply that to the psychology of a relationship, the consequences are terrifyingly clear.
They really are.
You could have the deepest, most tension-tested friendship in the world, coupled with the wildest, most electric passion.
Sounds great.
It does. But if you stop tending to the rose garden, if you stop providing that daily, tender emotional care, the structure eventually topples.
It has to. Or consider another variation. You can have a really deep, tender, emotional love and a fantastic friendship where you communicate perfectly.
Okay.
But if you lose that unbridled passion, if the spark dies completely, the structure is fatally compromised.
It wobbles under the pressure of life.
Exactly.
And this is the author's stark warning to you, the listener. You cannot prioritize one leg while hoping the other two carry the load.
It doesn't work that way.
If any single leg is missing from the foundation, or if one snaps under the pressure of carrying the harmonic pole we talked about, the entire relationship collapses.
The whole thing goes down.
There is no such thing as a two-legged stool that can hold the weight of a human life. All three must be nurtured simultaneously, with equal vigilance.
And just as we, the readers, grasp the theoretical perfection of this structural metaphor, the text delivers this completely devastating blow.
Oh man, this part.
Yeah, the deep dive shifts violently from philosophical theory into raw, painfully real vulnerability.
Because up until this moment in the narrative, Professor Cromwell-Smith has been the authoritative guide.
He's the expert.
Right, he is dispensing this timeless, flawless wisdom from his mentor. But as he finishes reading about the three-legged stool to his hushed auditorium, his entire demeanor fractures.
The scene is incredibly visceral.
Tell us what happens.
The text notes that his tight lips tremble, and the students watch in transfixed silence as teardrops slowly trace their way down his pained face.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. This titan of academia standing at the podium, suddenly caught in a twisted bundle of what the text calls suppressed grief.
Why is a man who understands the structural engineering of love so perfectly breaking down in front of his class?
Because he isn't just reciting abstract theory.
Right.
The crushing philosophical weight of this climax is the realization that the professor is weeping because he is reading the exact blueprint of his own failure.
Wow.
He is explaining to his students how and why his own three-legged stool broke 40 years prior.
He lived the collapse.
He did.
He had the harmonic pole in his hands, he stepped out onto the tightrope, and he dropped it. One of his legs snapped.
And this is the ultimate transition the chapter forces us to make. We move from the blissful peace and ease of the early rabbit hole,
Right.
past the academic diagrams of stools and poles, and we smash directly into the raw vulnerability of adult love.
It completely recontextualizes the burden and blessing of true love.